Obese girl forced to marry. Dead man's brother as punishment. Mountain man stopped wedding and took her. "Hold her still," Silas Whitmore hissed. "A wife doesn't need breath to obey." Autumn 1883. The town of Redemption sat under a copper sky. The little clapboard church packed tight with polite cowardice. White lilies soured in stale air. A dress that wasn't hers bit Dorothea Blackwell's ribs like a trap. Seams sawing her skin, lace strangling the soft column of her throat. She stood beside a man twice her age and 3 times as cruel, wrists mottled where his fingers had taught her the grammar of threat. 6 months earlier, there had been laughter, a shy ring, a bright boy's smile named Edmund, Silas's younger brother, who spoke to Thea as if she were the first warm sunrise after a winter that wouldn't end. But a horse stumbled, a skull struck stone, and love went into the ground without a marker. What rose in its place was a family decree older than mercy. The bride passes to the next surviving son. Property should not wander. Women are the fence posts that keep a fortune from blowing away. Her father, Harold Blackwell, folded by debt and fear, had said the words that chained her more tightly than iron. "We owe them. You will do this. If you refuse, we lose the farm." He wouldn't meet her eyes. He had already sold them. Now, under the cross and a painted Christ whose gaze could not seem to settle anywhere, Reverend Thomas opened the book with hands that trembled at their own obedience. "Dearly beloved," he began, and the pews answered with silence, the kind that helps cruelty keep its balance. Thea tried to breathe. The bodice didn't forgive. Sweat threaded her spine. Her vision pulsed at the edges. "Speak clearly," Silas murmured, a smile that wasn't a smile cutting his face. "If you faint, I'll have you carried to my house anyway." When the Reverend's voice reached that old hinge in the ceremony, if anyone here knows of a reason, there was a ripple, a gust, a sudden brightness as the church doors slammed wide. Light poured up the aisle like a river breaking its banks. In that blaze, a figure stood, tall as the doorway, coat dusted with pine pollen and road, hair silvered by years the wilderness keeps for itself. He walked forward without hurry, boot heels measuring out a verdict on the wooden floor. A revolver rode his hip, a scar rode his jaw, the law rode somewhere behind his eyes. When he spoke, the nave found its spine. "I object." Murmurs broke, then died. Silas turned, red rising like fever. "Name yourself." "Gideon Blackwood," the man said, voice even as a level. "Former judge of this circuit, present servant of what's left of justice." "This is a family matter," Silas snapped. "No," Gideon said, stepping between the bride and the man who wrapped himself in the word husband like a weapon. "It is a crime disguised as a custom. Consent is not a thing you can forge with threats." He looked at Thea then, not at the dress, not at the body the town had taught itself to sneer at, but at the person drowning behind her eyes. "Miss Blackwell," he asked, gentler, as if the question itself were a hand breaking water, "do you want this marriage?" Thea's throat burned, terror pressed, and then, through the tight silk and tighter fear, something rose that had been waiting since the day Edmund died. "No," she said, hoarse but whole. "I do not. Outside this little story, somewhere in Saigon or Sydney or Savannah, you, listening with your own breath held, know the sound of a single word turning the world. Tell me where you're hearing this from, because what happens next will test every man in that room and every law this town pretends to keep." Thea's single word hung in the air like a thunderclap. "No." It wasn't loud, but it cut through the church like a crack in glass. Reverend Thomas froze mid-sentence, his voice faltering into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Thea's chest heaved under the too-tight bodice, her breath sharp and shaking. Silas Whitmore's eyes widened with disbelief, then hardened into fury. His grip on her wrist tightened until her bones ached. "You don't know what you're saying," he hissed. "You will marry me." Before she could reply, Gideon Blackwood stepped closer, his long shadow falling across both of them. "Take your hand off her," he said quietly, the kind of quiet that made men hesitate. Silas laughed harshly. "You're mad, old man. This is our business. She belongs to me now." Gideon's blue-gray eyes turned to steel. "Belongs?" His tone dropped lower. "The law doesn't recognize ownership of people in this territory. Not anymore, and certainly not under my watch." Gasps rippled through the pews. No one dared breathe as Gideon reached forward and unclamped Silas's hand from Thea's wrist, his fingers steady, unhurried, absolute. Silas tried to pull back, but Gideon's grip was unmovable. "She said no," Gideon continued, his voice carrying through the hushed chapel. "And unless you've gone deaf or worse, that's the end of it." Reverend Thomas cleared his throat, looking suddenly decades older. "He's right, Silas. If the lady refuses, I cannot continue the ceremony. It would be unlawful." Silas's face turned crimson. "Unlawful? My family built half this town. You'll side with this hermit?" Gideon didn't blink. "I was a judge before I was a hermit. I know what coercion looks like." A murmur of approval rose from a few brave souls in the pews, but most stayed silent, glancing nervously toward the Whitmore men. Silas's brothers shifted uneasily, hands near their belts, not yet ready to challenge the legend standing in front of them. Gideon turned to Thea, his voice softening. "Miss Blackwell, you have two choices. You can stay and let them decide your fate, or you can walk out with me right now and be free of them. I'll see you safe." Thea's lips trembled. For a lifetime she'd been told what she could and couldn't do, what to eat, how to dress, who to marry. She'd learned to keep her head bowed, her voice swallowed, but something in Gideon's tone, steady, certain, unafraid, cracked open a place inside her she thought long dead. "I want to leave," she whispered. Gideon nodded once. "Then you're leaving." He took off his coat, a heavy duster smelling faintly of pine and smoke, and draped it over her shoulders. It swallowed the torn lace in trembling hands, cloaking her in warmth and defiance. Then he turned back to the crowd. "No one here will stop us." The silence was electric. Silas stepped forward, trembling with rage. "You'll regret this, Blackwood. You're interfering with Whitmore business." "Then you better tell your business," Gideon said, his voice low but carrying. "Because when the sheriff hears that you forced a woman to marry you against her will, the only wedding you'll see is between you and the gallows." Silas's jaw clenched, but he didn't move. Everyone knew the stories about Gideon Blackwood, the judge who'd vanished into the mountains after losing his family in a fire, the man who'd hunted outlaws and returned them to justice bound and alive, never dead, a man who feared nothing because the worst had already happened to him. Gideon extended his hand toward Thea. "Let's go." Her fingers slipped into his, small and cold. Together, they turned down the aisle, the creak of floorboard sounding like drum beats of rebellion. Reverend Thomas stepped aside, eyes glistening with quiet relief. As they passed through the open doors, a gust of autumn air swept into the church, scattering petals from the wedding bouquet across the pews like fallen promises. Thea looked back only once, saw her father's bowed head, Silas's livid stare, and the congregation's shameful stillness, and then she faced forward. Outside, the sunlight was blinding, pure, endless. Gideon helped her onto his horse without a word, mounted behind her, and with one tug on the reins, they rode away from redemption, leaving behind the church, the whispers, and the cage that had nearly closed forever. For the first time in years, Dorothea Blackwell breathed freely. The trail out of redemption wound into the mountains like a scar, dust rising behind the horses' hooves as Gideon and Thea rode hard toward the line of pines. Thea clung to him at first, her fingers gripping his coat as if the world might still reach out and drag her back. But as miles passed beneath them, the sound of town faded, the murmuring gossip, the creak of pews, the voice that once called her property. All that remained was wind. They rode until the sun dipped low, painting the sky with bruised gold and violet. When the horse finally slowed at a shallow stream, Gideon reined in and dismounted. "We'll rest here," he said quietly. Thea's legs trembled when her boots touched the ground. The dress, heavy, torn, and cruelly tight, clung like memory. Gideon noticed her discomfort. Without a word, he drew a hunting knife and sliced the corset laces down the back. Thea gasped as the air flooded her lungs again. "Better?" She nodded, tears threatening. "I haven't breathed since morning." He built a small fire, the movements efficient and practiced. Sparks rose into the dusk, catching briefly in his silver hair. He handed her a tin cup filled with cool water from the stream. "Drink slow. You've had a day too long for one heart to carry." Thea took a sip. "You shouldn't have done it," she said softly. "They'll come after us. The Whitmores don't forgive." Gideon's gaze lifted from the fire. "Let them come. I've met worse men with better excuses." Thea almost smiled. It was the first hint of warmth that day. When night fell, he cooked beans and dried venison in an iron pot. The smell made her stomach twist with hunger, but she hesitated. "I can't eat much. I'm used to less." He passed her a bowl anyway. "Then you'll learn to be used to enough." She stared at him across the firelight, the words echoing louder than he meant them to. Enough. No one had ever spoken to her like that, not with pity, not with scorn, but with quiet certainty that she deserved more than scraps of love and air. Later, when she began to drift asleep by the fire, Gideon took his coat and laid it over her shoulders again. The mountains whispered in the dark. The horse snorted softly nearby. Gideon sat awake, his rifle across his knees, eyes on the flames. He didn't pray often anymore, but that night he did. Not for safety, he could manage that, but for forgiveness, for arriving 20 years too late to save his own wife and child. At dawn, mist rolled low through the trees. Gideon brewed coffee and offered her a tin cup, strong and black. Thea winced at the bitterness, but drank it anyway. They continued north, the horse stepping carefully over frost-laced roots. Thea began to talk, small, hesitant words at first. She told him of Edmund, the brother she loved, the one whose laughter still haunted her dreams. She told him of the shame she'd been made to carry since childhood, of whispers in town calling her too much of everything, too large, too quiet, too emotional, too alive. Gideon listened without interrupting, eyes fixed on the horizon. When she finished, he said simply, "You deserve gentleness. That's the only truth that matters now." By noon, the land opened to high meadow and wildflowers gone to seed. Gideon stopped by a stream to water the horse, and Thea watched him kneel, sleeves rolled up, washing the dust from his hands. She saw the scars there, long pale lines across tanned skin, and wondered how many battles a man must fight to earn silence like his. "Were you really a judge?" she asked quietly. "I was," he said. "Once." "What happened?" He hesitated, jaw tight. "The law doesn't always keep its promises, so I made my own." They rode again. Thea noticed the rhythm of his breathing, the steady control of his movements. Every time she looked over her shoulder, expecting pursuit, he would murmur, "Keep your eyes ahead. You're not theirs anymore." When the sky darkened toward evening, snow began to fall, thin flakes that melted on her hands. "Is it far?" she asked. "Far enough to start over," he said. The cabin appeared at last through the trees, a stout timber house tucked against a cliff, smoke rising faintly from a chimney, a place untouched by the world's cruelty. Gideon helped her down and led her inside. The air was warm, smelling of cedar and sage. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books, tools, and carefully labeled jars of herbs. Everything here spoke of order, solitude, and quiet discipline. "This is your home?" she asked. "It was," he said. "Now it's ours until you choose otherwise." Thea turned in a slow circle, taking in the soft glow of firelight, the table set with 2 tin plates, the single rose carved into the mantel. "It's beautiful." "It's safe," he corrected gently. "That's better than beautiful." For the first time in her life, Dorothea Blackwell felt that word settle inside her, not as something borrowed, but something earned. Outside, the snow fell harder, wrapping the cabin in a hush so deep it felt like forgiveness. The first morning in Gideon's cabin began with silence, a kind of silence Thea had never known. Not the fearful stillness of a room waiting for anger, but a quiet so alive she could hear the ticking of wood cooling in the stove and the slow sigh of wind through pine boughs. For the first time in years, she woke without someone calling her name like an order. The bed was soft and heavy with quilts. Her body ached from days of riding, but it was a clean ache, the kind that meant she was still here, still alive. She pulled on the wool shirt Gideon had left folded at the end of the bed. It smelled faintly of smoke and leather. Outside the door, she could hear him moving, measured, careful sounds of a man who didn't waste motion. When she stepped into the main room, Gideon was tending the fire, sleeves rolled to the elbows, hair damp from the cold water of morning. The smell of coffee and cornmeal porridge filled the air. "Morning," he said, not turning yet. "I wasn't sure if you'd sleep through the storm." "It's hard to sleep when your bones still think they're running," she answered, her voice shy but steady. He looked over his shoulder, a ghost of a smile tugging at his mouth. "You don't have to run here." Thea sat at the small table near the window. Outside, the world was wide and endless, snow frosting the trees like glass. For the first time since the church, she felt her breath come easily. Gideon handed her a steaming bowl and a spoon. "Eat first," he said. "We talk better on a full stomach." She obeyed without argument. The porridge was simple, sweetened with a little molasses, but it felt like a feast. When she finished, he poured her another cup of coffee and said quietly, "You can stay as long as you need. There's work here if you want it, peace if you don't." She nodded, overwhelmed. "I've never had either." The days passed in slow, rhythmic order. Gideon chopped wood, repaired the fence, and set traps down by the frozen creek. Thea tended to the cabin, finding quiet pleasure in sweeping floors, baking bread, and mending his worn shirts. At first, she worked because she needed to, because doing nothing felt too much like helplessness. But soon, she worked because she wanted to. Each evening, they shared supper by lamplight. Sometimes Gideon would tell her stories from his days on the circuit, how justice could be both sword and noose depending on whose hand it served. Thea listened, chin resting on her hand, learning that strength could be quiet, that a man didn't need to shout to be dangerous. Once she asked, "Why did you leave the courts?" He hesitated before answering. "Because I judged a man guilty of murder, and the law hanged him. Later, I found the proof that would have freed him." He looked into the fire, his face unreadable. "After that, I decided if I was to make mistakes, I'd rather make them trying to save someone than trying to condemn them." Thea didn't know what to say, so she simply laid a hand on his sleeve. He didn't move away. By midwinter, the cabin began to change in ways Gideon hadn't expected. Thea filled it with color, wildflowers pressed between the pages, dried herbs hanging from beams, a quilt of blue scraps she was piecing together in the evenings. She sang while she worked, softly, as if testing the sound of her own voice again after years of silence. One night, he came in from the cold and paused at the door, listening. The sound of her humming filled the air, fragile but warm, like light through frost. He realized then that his home, once a fortress of solitude, had become something living again. Thea turned and caught him watching. "You should tell me if it's too much," she said quickly. "All this clutter." He shook his head. "It's the first time this place has sounded like life. Don't you dare stop." She laughed softly, and the sound startled them both with how right it felt. Gideon taught her how to shoot, how to aim by breath and not by fear. The first time she hit a tin can off the fence post, she let out a surprised laugh, clapping her hands to her mouth. Gideon chuckled. "You'll do just fine if trouble ever comes calling." "I don't want to kill anyone," she said. "Neither do I," he answered. "That's why we practice, to make sure we don't have to." He showed her how to fish beneath the ice, how to read animal tracks in snow, and how to find north by the stars. She learned fast, eager to replace helplessness with skill. At night, when she was too tired to move, he would read aloud from an old Bible. Not sermons, but the stories of people who refused to bow to fear. The more time passed, the more she began to look at him differently, not as her rescuer, but as a man. There were mornings she caught herself watching the way the light slid down the curve of his jaw, or the way he smiled when she teased him about his endless caution. It frightened her, the idea that her heart, once shattered, might still know how to beat this way. One evening, snow fell in heavy sheets. The wind howled through the chimney, and the cabin groaned like an old ship. Gideon was mending a trap by the hearth when Thea said quietly, "You risked everything to save me. Why?" He looked up, startled by the rawness in her voice. "Because no one saved my wife," he said at last. "Because I watched a world that should have known better let her die." Thea's breath caught. "You loved her very much." "I still do," he said simply. "But grief doesn't stop you from seeing when someone else needs a hand out of the fire." Tears welled in her eyes. "Then maybe God sent you to stop another fire before it started." Gideon smiled faintly. "Maybe he sent me to remind you that you were never meant to burn." Silence settled again, deep and steady. The only sound was the crackle of pine logs. Thea reached out, her hand hovering before it finally rested on his. His skin was rough, scarred, but warm. He didn't pull away. They sat like that for a long time, two people scarred by different wars, the distance between them narrowing with every heartbeat. When the thaw came, the first patch of earth appeared outside the cabin. Dark, rich soil. Thea planted seeds there, humming softly as she worked. Gideon watched from the porch, a mug of coffee in his hand, and thought that perhaps redemption didn't come in courts or sermons. It came in moments like this, in the sight of someone who'd once been broken, kneeling in the sun, planting new life. He smiled when she looked up. That'll make a fine garden. She wiped her brow, cheeks flushed. It already is. And as the wind carried the scent of pine and meltwater down the valley, Gideon realized that his cabin had become more than shelter. It had become a home, and Thea, without ever meaning to, had become its heart. Spring came early to the mountains, melting the snow into streams that sang through the valleys. Thea's garden sprouted green shoots, small but defiant, like her. Gideon watched from the porch as she knelt in the dirt, humming to herself, her laughter soft as the wind. Each morning felt like a second chance neither of them had asked for, but somehow deserved. Yet peace, he knew, was a visitor, not a resident. It never stayed long. One afternoon, Gideon rode into the nearest trading post, a half-day's ride down the mountain, to buy salt and lamp oil. The air inside was thick with the smell of leather and tobacco. As he stepped in, the room fell silent. Mountain men didn't come down often, and Gideon Blackwood's name still carried the weight of half a dozen legends. Two men near the counter stopped talking when they saw him, but not fast enough. "Whitmore's offering gold for her," one whispered. "Alive. Says she was kidnapped." Gideon's hand froze over the sack of flour. "Where did you hear that?" The trader, an old man with wary eyes, cleared his throat. "Word's spreading. Silas Whitmore's gone to the territorial marshal in Carson City. Says you took his betrothed. He's showing a marriage license." Gideon's voice dropped. "Forgery." The trader nodded slowly. "Maybe, but men like Whitmore don't need the truth. They've got money." Gideon paid double for his supplies, mounted his horse, and rode home hard. The mountains blurred around him, trees rushing past like ghosts. By the time the cabin came into view, dusk had turned the world blue. Thea met him at the door, worry etched into her face. "What's wrong?" He took a long breath before answering. "They're coming, Thea. Silas isn't finished." That night, the fire burned low. Thea sat at the table, her hands clasped tightly. "I thought the law was supposed to protect us." Gideon looked into the flames. "The law protects the powerful, not the right. I learned that the hard way." He stood and went to a small chest by the wall. When he opened it, Thea saw a stack of papers bound with twine, edges yellowed with age. "These are rulings I wrote when I was still a judge. Every one of them cost someone their life or their freedom because I was too afraid to stand against men like Whitmore." He paused, eyes distant. "I can't undo what I did back then, but I can make sure the next person doesn't pay for my cowardice." Thea rose and crossed the room to him. "You're not the same man," she said quietly. "You saved me." He looked at her, the weight of memory and gratitude reflected in the lines around his eyes. "Maybe, but saving one person doesn't erase the ones I couldn't." Her hand brushed his arm. "Then let this be enough for now." 3 days later, a rider approached the cabin. Gideon stepped out, rifle in hand, but it was Reverend Thomas, his horse lathered with sweat. The clergyman dismounted, gasping for breath. "They've issued a warrant," he said. "Marshall's men. They'll be here within a week." Thea's heart dropped. "A warrant for what?" "For kidnapping," Thomas said, his eyes filled with shame. "And for obstruction of marriage." Gideon's mouth tightened. "Marriage isn't a prison sentence. They'll find that out soon enough." The Reverend handed him a folded envelope. "I brought this because you deserve to see it first." It was from Silas, scrawled in cruel, angular script. "Enjoy your whore while you can. The law will hang you soon enough. She'll be mine again before the first snow." Gideon crushed the paper in his fist, veins rising on his arm. For the first time, Thea saw fury blaze in his eyes, not wild, but controlled, cold as forged steel. He threw the letter into the fire. "Let him come." Thea touched his sleeve. "Gideon, no. You can't fight the whole world." He turned to her, voice low. "I've fought worse battles for less cause." Later that night, when the Reverend had gone, Thea sat by the fire staring at the last embers. "There's something I haven't told you," she said quietly. Gideon looked up. "What is it?" "The Whitmores didn't just want me for appearance or revenge. Edmund left something for me before he died, a deed to a parcel of land. It's small, but it borders the Whitmore estate. Silas found out and said it belonged to his family now, but Edmund had signed it over to me. My name's on the papers." She opened her hand. Inside lay a folded parchment, worn soft from being hidden too long. Gideon read it, eyebrows lifting. "This could ruin Silas. It proves motive, inheritance, everything." Thea nodded. "That's why he'll never stop until I'm gone." Gideon folded the paper again, jaw set. "Then we'll make sure the law sees this before he buries it in blood." Over the next days, they prepared. Gideon cleaned his weapons and stocked provisions. Thea practiced shooting until she could hit a tin cup off the fence from 30 paces. Each night, they spoke less and less, the weight of what was coming pressing against the walls. On the final evening before the marshal's men were expected, rain fell hard and steady. Gideon sat by the fire, oiling his rifle. Thea approached, her voice soft. "If we don't make it out of this—" He stopped her with a raised hand. "We will." She shook her head. "Then promise me something. Promise me that if you have to choose, you'll save yourself." He met her eyes, that quiet fire in them, steady as always. "I already made my choice the day I walked into that church." Thea's throat tightened. She knelt beside him, her hand resting on his. "Then let me fight beside you." He smiled faintly. "You already are." Outside, thunder rolled through the valley. Inside, 2 souls waited, not for mercy, but for the reckoning they both knew was coming. The storm came at dawn. Wind ripped through the trees, bending them low. Thea woke to the sound of hooves pounding through the mud, many of them. Gideon was already at the window, his silhouette framed by lightning. "They're here," he said. Outside, shapes emerged from the gray, a dozen riders in long coats, rifles glinting wet. At their head rode Silas Whitmore, his face pale and sharp, like something carved out of vengeance. Behind him flew the territorial marshal's banner, but everyone knew who was really giving orders. Thea's heartbeat thundered in her chest. "They brought the law." "No," Gideon said. "They brought their version of it." He checked his rifle, calm as a man buttoning his coat. Then he looked at her, his expression softening just enough to make her forget the fear for one fragile heartbeat. "Stay behind the hearth. Don't fire unless you must." "I'm not hiding," she said. "I know." He gave a single nod. "That's why I trust you." Outside, Silas dismounted, shouting above the wind, "Blackwood, you're under arrest for abduction and murder." Gideon stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, coat whipping behind him. "Funny," he said evenly, "you keep using that word law, yet the only person here with a legal deed of ownership to land is the woman you tried to enslave." A flicker of hesitation crossed the marshal's face, but Silas barked, "She's a liar! She forged those papers!" Gideon tossed the folded parchment toward the marshal's horse. "Then read it. Edmund Whitmore's signature, your own brother's hand. I can vouch for it. I knew his handwriting when I was judge for this circuit." The marshal bent, scanning the ink under the rain. His jaw twitched. "This looks legitimate." Silas's temper broke. "To hell with that! She's mine!" He drew his revolver, aiming not at Gideon, but at the cabin door. Thea saw the muzzle flash before she heard the sound. A bullet splintered the frame beside her cheek. Without thinking, she fired back. The shot cracked through the storm and struck Silas's hat clean off his head. The men shouted. Confusion rippled like fire in dry grass. "Enough!" Gideon roared, stepping forward. "This ends here." Silas swung his gun toward him, but Gideon was faster. His rifle thundered once, the sound swallowed by the rain. Silas stumbled backward, clutching his arm, the pistol falling from his hand. The marshal shouted for order, but the men hesitated, uncertain. The spell of Whitmore power had broken. They'd seen too much, heard too much. Thea ran out onto the porch, rain soaking her hair, the deed clutched in one hand. "Marshal, you want proof? Here." She thrust the paper forward, voice clear and fierce. "He murdered his first wife. Ask the Reverend, ask the neighbors. They saw what he did." Reverend Thomas, who had ridden up behind the posse unseen, now called out, "It's true. I have the letter, the witness who confessed it." The marshal's decision came down like the crack of thunder. "Silas Whitmore, you're under arrest for murder and falsifying state documents." Silas tried to lunge at Thea, fury twisting his face, but Gideon stepped between them and struck him once. Hard, final. The man crumpled into the mud, the fight leaving his body like air from a bellows. When it was over, the world felt impossibly still. The men bound Silas's hands, the marshal leading him toward the horses. Reverend Thomas pressed Thea's hands together, whispering, "You were brave, child, braver than all of us." Gideon stood by the porch, drenched to the bone, watching as justice finally rode down the valley. Thea turned to him, the rain mixing with tears on her cheeks. "It's done," she whispered. He nodded slowly. "It's done." They stood there as the storm faded into morning. The sun broke through the clouds in thin, trembling rays, touching the cabin roof with gold. Gideon reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. "Let's go inside," he said quietly. "We've weathered enough." When the storm finally passed, the mountains smelled of pine and wet earth. Streams of sunlight slipped through torn clouds, turning the soaked valley into glass. Smoke rose gently from the cabin chimney, steady, peaceful. Inside, the fire was burning again. Thea sat by it, wrapped in one of Gideon's wool blankets, her damp hair falling loose over her shoulders. She stared into the flames as if they were retelling the entire story in quiet, orange tongues. The church, the fear, the long ride, the first breath of freedom. Gideon moved slowly, his shoulder bruised from the fight. He poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her. "They'll take Silas south to Carson City," he said softly. "The marshal means to see it through this time." Thea nodded, clutching the cup in both hands. "He'll hang?" "Yes," Gideon said. "But that's not justice. That's just the end of him." She looked up, meeting his eyes. "And what's justice, then?" He hesitated before answering. "You living free, you laughing again, you planting your garden and sleeping through the night without looking over your shoulder." For a long moment they said nothing. Only the wind spoke, threading through the cracks of the cabin. Then Thea reached out and covered his scarred hand with her own. "You gave me that chance," she whispered. "You gave me everything." Gideon's throat tightened. "I gave you a door. You walked through it on your own." Her smile trembled, half laughter, half tears. "Then maybe we could keep walking together." He looked at her, eyes soft as dusk over the valley. "Are you sure, Thea? I'm not a gentle man. I've been broken in more ways than I can count." "You're the gentlest man I've ever known," she said simply. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was a promise being born. Gideon leaned forward, brushing his lips against her forehead, a gesture more sacred than any vow spoken in a church. "Then stay," he whispered. "Stay, and we'll build something better than what the world offered us." Outside, the river ran clear again, carrying away the last of the storm. By summer, the cabin would be surrounded by flowers. Thea's laughter would drift through the open windows, and Gideon's deep voice would answer it from the fields. 2 souls once scarred by fire and fear, learning, slowly, stubbornly, that love built on choice could heal what cruelty once tried to own. He turned to her, smiling. "You're safe here." She smiled back, tears bright in her eyes. "It's home now, if you'll have me." He nodded once. "Always." And in that quiet mountain light, Dorothea Blackwell and Gideon Blackwood began the rest of their lives, not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals bound by something stronger than law, stronger than fear, the freedom to choose love. Every time I share a story like this, I'm reminded that love isn't about rescue, it's about choice. No one should ever be forced to belong to anyone. Somewhere out there, maybe you're listening from London, Manila, Hanoi, or Denver, someone still believes that kindness can rewrite the ending. If this story found a place in your heart, tell me where you're watching from. Because every comment, every shared heartbeat reminds us that hope travels farther than cruelty ever could. And if you still believe in second chances, stay a while. The next story is already waiting for you.